Hi folks, Dr. Robert Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I wanted to do a rather shorter video today, and I just wanted to do a video that defines really what the Western diet is, so that those people that watch some of my other videos, when I refer to the Western diet, or the typical Western diet as it's sometimes called, they have a resource that they can quickly go to see what exactly is the Western diet. So I'll describe what the Western diet is and the factors that you can look at a diet to see how closely it conforms to this typical Western diet. And I will also put in the comments box below this video, I will also put a scientific nutritional paper that discusses the components of the typical Western diet. Now obviously this is subjective. There is no real diet called a typical Western diet. It's just a group of characteristics that are put together to try and describe the food that is most commonly eaten in developed countries. When we're talking about the Western diet, Western nations are really defined as Western Europe, as North America, and as Australasia. So they're really the Western countries. There are other developed countries, but that's what's usually referred to when we refer to Western nations or Western countries. And those countries all have those areas, the countries within those areas have quite similar diets. Europe is a little bit different. There are still regions within Europe that eat traditional diets, but generally North Americans, Canadians, the great people from Great Britain, people from Australia, people from New Zealand, they tend to eat the same kind of foods. And you can define these foods, I think you can define the diet they eat in 7 ways. The first thing to look at is the glycemic load. The second thing to look at is the fatty acid composition. The third thing to look at is the macronutrient composition. The fourth thing to look at is the micronutrient density. Then you can look at the acid-base balance, and you can look at the sodium to potassium ratio, and lastly you can look at the fibre content. So if we take each one of those things very briefly in turn, this I think is the defining characteristic of a typical Western diet and why it is different from the foods that we tended to eat globally in the past, the traditional diets. So the classic traditional diet is the Mediterranean diet. That is the diet that has historically and traditionally been eaten by those people that live around the Mediterranean Sea, and that's really given the gold standard in terms of its ability to produce health. But that doesn't mean it's the only traditional diet that can produce health. There are other traditional diets that have been looked at, the Okinawan diet, the Nordic diet, for example. There's a lot of research on traditional eating practices. And these traditional diets tend to differ from the typical Western diet in these 7 factors. So I'll bring the 7 factors up again as a list so you can have a look at them. And I'll just briefly list them again so you know what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the glycemic load. I'm going to talk about the fatty acid composition. I'm going to talk about the macronutrient composition, the micronutrient density, the acid-base balance, the sodium to potassium ratio, and the fibre content. So the first thing to look at is the glycemic load. Most people are aware of what the glycemic index is. The glycemic index is a representation of how quickly your blood sugar will rise when you eat a particular carbohydrate food. The glycemic load is slightly different because it takes into account the amount of the carbohydrate that you're actually eating. So a good example of this is parsnips. Parsnips has a very high glycemic index, but they tend not to cause a very large rise in blood sugar because there isn't actually much starch within the parsnip. So although the starch that is there will cause quite a large rise in blood sugar, quite a rapid rise in blood sugar, there's not a great deal of carbohydrate in parsnips, and therefore they tend not to have detrimental effects. The Western diet tends to have foods that are generally have a high glycemic index, but they also tend to be eaten in quite high concentrations, and therefore they cause a large and rapid rise in blood sugar, and this can lead to the development of insulin resistance and the development of glycemic problems, which can cause obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease. So that's the first thing that really defines the Western diet. It tends to contain foods that are generally of high glycemic index, but it also contains those foods tend to be eaten in quite high concentrations, which produces you're pushing too much carbohydrate into your blood at the same time, and the body can't really deal with that amount of blood sugar, and therefore it causes detrimental biochemical effects. The next thing to look at is the fatty acid composition. Now, the fatty acid composition, what we're really talking about primarily is the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Now, the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is contentious. It's not exactly sure what that ratio should be, and it might vary between individuals. But really, for every 3 grams of omega-6 fat, you need 1 gram of omega-3 fatty acids, somewhere around that, although the ratio may be closer to 1 to 1 for some individuals. The problem is the Western diet supplies far too much omega-6 fat and far too little omega-3 fat, and the ratio may be as much as 10 to 20 grams of omega-6 to every 1 gram of omega-3, and that it leads to inflammation and oxidative stress, because those fatty acids that belong to the omega-6 and omega-3 families are involved in the regulation of inflammation. They produce chemicals, short-lived hormones in cells called eicosanoids, and those eicosanoids can regulate inflammation. So when you have too many omega-6s and not enough omega-3s, you tend to cause inflammation and oxidative stress, and that can lead to many of the typical Western lifestyle diseases like cardiovascular disease, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. So that's the second consideration, and that's the second thing that's wrong with the Western diet. The third thing that's wrong is the macronutrient profile. There is no real correct macronutrient profile. The problem with the Western diet is the macronutrients it contains are the wrong types. So I don't think there is anything wrong with a high carbohydrate diet, and also there's nothing wrong with a high protein diet. The problem with the Western diet is the carbohydrates, the starches are all refined. The proteins tend on the whole to be from fatty meat, so it provides too much saturated fat with them. And the fat, like we've already discussed, is not of the correct types. There's too much saturated fat, there's not enough omega-3 fats, there's too much omega-6 fats. So what you actually tend to find is that the Western diet has an adulterated macronutrient profile. Whichever way you look at it, if you look at the different traditional diets, they all have slightly different macronutrient profiles. But what they tend to have is when carbohydrates are present, they tend to be unrefined in their whole grain form. The proteins tend to be from high quality animals that are grown and raised in an organic way, so their fatty acid composition is much healthier. And the fats that are present in the diet tends to be more balanced. They tend to be, for example, in the Mediterranean diet, they can be from higher amounts of monounsaturated fat that may come from plants. In the Eskimo diet, for example, the fats come mainly from fish, and therefore the diet is high in omega-3 fats. So the other thing that's wrong, the third thing that's wrong with the Western diet is that the macronutrient profile is quite detrimental. It provides too many macronutrients that are of poor quality and not enough macronutrients of high quality, and the profile is usually wrong. There's usually far too many refined carbohydrates. There's usually far too many low quality proteins, and there's usually a high amount of saturated fat and omega-6 fats, and those things put together can cause detrimental effects like oxidative stress and inflammation, which adds to the other problems that I've already mentioned. If we go to the fourth component of the Western diet that is a defining factor, we look at the micronutrient density. Most traditional diets contain foods that contain low amounts of calories relative to the amount of micronutrients they have in them. In other words, they have a high micronutrient density. So when you eat your foods, you're getting lots of vitamins and minerals for each calorie that you consume. The main problem with the Western diet is the opposite is true. For every calorie you consume, there is only a very small amount of micronutrients. So you're getting far too much energy and far too few of the micronutrients that you require in order to be able to utilize that energy. So what you tend to find is that those people that consume a Western diet tend to be consuming too many calories, and they tend to get nutrient deficiency diseases, and that stops their metabolic pathways working, and that leads to the development of Western lifestyle diseases. So that's the fourth thing that is wrong with the the Western diet. The fifth thing that's wrong with the Western diet that is a defining characteristic is the acid-base balance that it produces in the blood of those people that consume it. This is not always true, but most traditional diets tend to be based on plant consumption. That's not true for the Eskimo diet, but that's a very different diet, probably deserves a different video. But most traditional diets tend to, because animals are difficult to raise, they're expensive to raise, they consume a lot of plant foods, they take up a lot of land, they use a lot of water, they take a lot of looking after. Most traditional diets are based on plant foods because they're cheaper, they're easier to grow, they provide more energy for the amount of effort you put into growing them, and therefore they're a better way or agriculturally to feed a population. When you eat plant foods tend to have an alkalizing effect on your blood. Animal protein, in contrast, but because of the sulfur amino acids it contains, it effectively produces sulfuric acid, which can then acidify your blood. So what we tend to find as a defining factor is that the Western diet will be an acidifying diet, whereas traditional diets are generally alkalizing diets. Now the Eskimo diet is slightly different, and yes, it does contain a lot of protein, and there are things that are wrong with the Eskimo diet. They do eat a lot of fish, they eat a lot of protein, they eat a lot of whale blubber. It's a very high fat, high protein diet, and they are not completely there are diseases that they get, possibly because of the diet they consume, but that's a contentious issue as well. What I'm doing is trying to generalize on traditional diets, the Mediterranean diet, the Okinawan diet, the Nordic diet. They're kind of plant-based diets. This is probably how we are supposed to eat based on our physiology, mostly plants, but with some protein, coming from kind of good sources of meat, eggs, dairy, those kind of things, but smaller amounts of them. But generally, I've always said, in all of my videos I've been consistent, your diet really should be based around plant foods, and those plants alkalize the blood, and that's important because when you acidify the blood, not only do you take the blood away from its, you're taking the blood out of its optimal pH range towards the higher, the lower end of that. You're acidifying, so you're dropping the pH. That stops or inhibits some of the enzymes, so your metabolic pathways don't work so well. But also the body tries to respond to that because it wants to protect the enzymes and keep them in the optimal pH range. What it does is it takes the minerals out of your bone, and those minerals have an alkalizing effect. And that's a very good way that the body can maintain the pH balance of the blood. The problem is that over the long term, you tend to demineralize your bone, and then that leads to diseases like osteoporosis. So osteoporosis is very likely a disease of the Western diet, being consumed over decades. You're really the cause of it is really too much acid in the blood. So this is something that's actively being researched at the moment and very important, and it's another defining characteristic of the Western diet. The sodium to potassium ratio I've done a video on before. The Western diet contains far too much sodium and far too little potassium. Again, the ratio is not fully known what it should be, but generally most plant diets will provide more potassium than sodium. You will get more potassium than sodium from a plant-based diet. If you eat the Western diet, you tend to get more sodium than potassium, so the ratio is reversed, and this leads to osmotic problems around your cells. It leads to blood pressure effects, not just because sodium, I've made videos on sodium. It's not always that sodium is problematic. It's the fact that it's also coupled with too little potassium. It's the ratio that's important. Yes, you don't want to be, consuming grams and grams of salts. That's not healthy. But, it's the ratio that's more important than the absolute amounts. And really, in a traditional plant-based diet, you should be consuming more potassium than sodium. But of course, in the Western diet, because sodium is added to foods, processed foods, to firstly make them taste nice, to make them addictive, and also as a preservative, there's far too much sodium in the diet. Lastly, the fibre content, which relates to the first point, which is the glycaemic load. Plant-based diets, traditional diets, have high amounts of fibre. This is something that's very contentious because different traditional diets have different amounts of fibre. But generally there should be a certain amount of fibre to go with the starch that you have. The more starch there is in the diet, the more fibre you need. Now let's have a look at the Eskimo diet, and let's have a look at the diet the Maasai eat. They generally eat high protein, high fat diets. Very small amounts of fibre in those diets, and yet those populations are protected from obesity and metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. Now the reason for that is that although they have very low amounts of fibre, they also have virtually no starch in their diet, and therefore they don't need the fibre. The fibre is really, you find fibre with the starch in plant foods. The fibre is there to stop the rapid absorption of the starch within those foods. When we process those starches, like the grains, in the Western diet, and we allow the foods to be, those starches to be eaten without the fibre, we produce a high glycaemic index. And like I said in the first point, that high glycaemic index coupled with a large intake of that carbohydrate food produces a large glycemic load, and that large glycemic load then dumps all of that carbohydrate, all of that starch into the blood at the same time, and this causes the nutrient overload syndrome, where the body has to go into almost like a panic mode to be able to get that starch, get that blood glucose levels down, because high blood glucose levels are detrimental to the body. It wants to remain in homeostatic conditions, so that it has a certain level of blood sugar and no more. If you dump all that carbohydrate into the blood at the same time, it causes glycemic problems, and therefore the body has to respond by releasing lots of insulin. And over time, if you keep doing this, if you keep eating too many of these refined low fiber starches, your body keeps releasing too much insulin. You tend to stress the pancreas. This leads to detrimental condition where you can develop insulin resistance, and ultimately you'll get poor glycemic control, which will down the road could lead to type 2 diabetes, and along the path you're going to gain weight, and you're going to put on a lot of body fat. So this is the problem with the Western diet. There's 7 characteristics really that you can use to define it, and all of those characteristics are have been researched and shown to be very detrimental to your health. So going over them again, the Western diet is characterized by having a large glycemic load, high glycemic load. It's got the incorrect fatty acid composition. It's got the incorrect macronutrient profile. Its macronutrient density is way too low. It's got an incorrect acid-base balance, producing too much acid in the blood. The sodium to potassium ratio is wrong, and also the fibre content is far too low. And if you use those 7 factors to look at your own diet, and you can say, well, how does my diet compare to that? There are Mediterranean diet scores that you can do, and maybe I'll do a video on that as well, where you can actually assess your diet to see how closely it relates to a Mediterranean diet. But really, that's the way to define a Western diet. That's the characterizing factors within the diet. Now, obviously, everybody within the Western Hemisphere, within those the developed countries, consumes a slightly different diet. But generally, if you look at the type of diets most people in those developed countries consume, those 7 factors are generally present. Yes, I agree that there is a growing awareness of the detrimental effects of the Western diet, and more people are starting to turn away from it and realize that traditional eating practices, based on the Mediterranean diet or the Okinawan diet or the Nordic diet, or whatever it is, these eating practices produce a much healthier individual. But the vast majority of people in the West, I think most people agree, still eat these types of detrimental foods. They're unaware of the benefits of eating healthily. And this is why I've done these series of videos, to try and tell as many people as possible about these very helpful diets that can be used, and also the dangers of consuming a Western diet. So I hope you found that interesting. As always, eat well, stay healthy, and protect yourself. And I will see you soon for another video. Take care.